With a game that has as much world building as Final Fantasy XVI does, it's really no surprise that there are going to be some mysteries unsolved, whether it be the fate of some characters after finishing the game, elements of the game that seem to be held back for a potential DLC maybe, or even the post-credit scene. There are some elements of the game that we just are left wondering. So my name is Ruben with Nerdspace, and here are 8 unanswered questions of Final Fantasy XVI after completing the game. And this should be pretty self-explanatory, but because we are talking about unanswered questions for Final Fantasy XVI, that does mean that we are going to dive into spoiler territory while talking about these questions. So with that out of the way, let's jump straight into it.
That he would die to protect me was plain. It was but a matter of when.
You planned this?
Number 8. How long was Olivier Ultima? For the longest point throughout the game, we are led to believe that maybe Ultima has influenced and controlled Dion's father, the Emperor of Sombrek. And it is revealed to us that actually Olivier is the one that has been controlled by Ultima. And not only has he been controlled, he has actually been turned into an Akashic. And Ultima now assumes his form at this point because of that. But one true unanswered question regarding Olivier is how long has Ultima been Olivier? Now, whenever Dion strikes Olivier, he disappears into those blue particles, which we have come to know that whenever an Akashic dies, this is actually the effect that happens, which pretty much tells us that Olivier was an Akashic. That being said, like I just mentioned, we don't really know how long this has been the case. Since Akashic is pretty much humans that have been exposed to too much ether, turning them into these types of creatures, it's really unclear as to how long Ultima has influenced Olivier. And that makes us wonder, how long has it been since Olivier officially died? Because that is the true realization with this whole situation, is that this was an actual human being at some point, meaning Olivier was killed and turned into an Akashic so that Ultima can influence his decisions and the decisions of the Empire. And unfortunately, we never get a true answer on this, because once this scene passes over, after we see the flashback scene with Dion, we don't really get to see exactly how long this has been the case. And in my opinion, it actually plays a pretty big part, because I actually really want to know how much influence Ultima has had over the Empire and for how long, because there's a lot of decisions that were made because of Ultima's influence. And if Ultima had influence over Olivier for a really long time, then some of the biggest decisions of the game might have actually been influenced by Ultima more than we actually realize. And if I missed something in Final Fantasy XVI, because there's a lot of lore that you unlock in the game, there might be some additional information that I'm missing somewhere, please hit up those comments, let me know if you have an idea where it may have described the whole relationship between Olivier and Ultima and how long that relationship lasted and when did he become an Akashic. Otherwise, this will remain as an unsolved, unclear, and unanswered mystery of Final Fantasy XVI. Number 7, Joshua's time gaps. So there are 2 points in the story where we really don't know exactly what happened with a specific character in Final Fantasy XVI, and that's actually during the time jumps with Joshua. So the first time jump we see is a 13-year time jump, and it happens after Phoenix Gate is attacked, and we see Clive get picked up by the Empire and enlisted in the Empire's army. However, all we really know about what happened to Joshua is that he was rescued by the Undying. And at some point during the 13 years, he started researching Ultima, because he started learning the origins of this creature known as Ultima. Outside of that, within those 13 years, we really don't know what Joshua has been up to, and we actually don't know some of the decisions he made, because he made some really questionable decisions. First off, the Undying obviously rescued him, that makes sense, but why did he not try to reach out to Clive? Because I felt like he knew Clive was alive. He didn't seem surprised at all that Clive was alive whenever he confronted both Clive and Ultima after the boss battle between Typhon and Ifrit. Why didn't he try to reach out to his family, someone he knew was alive? He could have got his help. with his research. And speaking of which, how did he conduct his research? How did he start researching Ultima? How did he learn of Ultima, and how did he figure out the path that led him to doing the type of research he did towards Ultima? There's a lot of unanswered questions, and we really don't know exactly what Joshua has been up to. And honestly, it seems like this was kind of left out on purpose, because it does make sense for this to be a potential DLC. Maybe we get to learn more about Joshua and about what he was up to during the events of this time gap. And even with that one aside, there's still yet another time gap with Joshua. Because once again, after he rescues Clive from Ultima, there is yet another time jump, and this time it's a 5-year time gap. And once again, other than him doing research on Ultima, we still have no idea what the hell he's doing other than trying to recover from the attacks that he is receiving from Ultima trying to escape him. Also, when we actually meet up with him after 5 years now, that's when he decides to go and try to reach out to Dion. Why wasn't this done sooner? I feel like this is something that should have been done sooner. Maybe he didn't realize until 5 years later that the Empire was being influenced by Ultima. Again, we don't really have too much information on that, and shining some light on that aspect of Joshua's journey would really help us understand exactly what he's been up to and how did he learn all this information that he received throughout those time gaps that he was missing and disappeared in. Number 6, the other continents. So other than some really lore segments that we actually receive after completing specific parts of Final Fantasy XVI, we really don't know too much about things outside of Valistia. We know there are other continents because people like Barnabas and his mother actually came to Valistia from a different continent, but we don't actually know the details of those other continents. We know Mid had talked about wanting to explore on a ship, that her plan is to go and explore around the world to visit other continents, as that was hers and her father's dream. But again, we never really get to explore that much, and I for one would really like to learn more about the other continents on this planet that Valistia is located at. We don't know how many continents are. We don't know if they're humans or if they're different types of race. Maybe they're filled with orcs and maybe even creatures similar to Ultima. But again, there are a lot of unanswered questions whenever we take a look at the rest of the continents, because we know they exist, we know they are there, we just don't know the state of those continents, we don't know the name of those continents, we don't know why they've kind of avoided Valistia for all this time. Maybe it has to do with the mother crystals. So learning more about those other continents and about where Barnabas and his mother came from would be really interesting. Now, we do know that apparently Barnabas's mother is actually part of a cult that is kind of originated from the Fallen, but the fact of the matter is that they traveled to some other continent at some point in time, and I would like to see more about that. Again, maybe this is left out on purpose because this might be a sequel for Final Fantasy XVI. Maybe we get Final Fantasy XVI Part 2. It wouldn't be the first time Final Fantasy did something just like that. And I think it's definitely one of the biggest unanswered questions when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI, and that's why it takes a spot on this list. Number 5, the Undying. So while we did learn a decent amount of information about the Undying, there are still some unanswered questions, mainly focusing on their decisions throughout Final Fantasy XVI, because they made some really questionable decisions. I said earlier when I was talking about Joshua's time gaps that I find it weird that Joshua actually didn't reach out to Clive or Byron about the fact that he was actually still alive. But honestly, I think the bigger question is, why aren't we directing this towards the Undying? Because they kind of played a huge part in all of this. So there's really about 4 questions that really bother me whenever we talk about the Undying. So honestly, they could take up 4 different spots on this list, because all 4 of these questions, in my opinion, are huge mysteries surrounding the Undying. So first off, I want to know how many there are, because that's never really clearly stated. It's just said that they are an organization that is secret and hidden from just about everybody for the most part, and that their sole purpose is to protect and carry out the will of the Phoenix. But another question that really bothers me about the Undying is, why didn't they rescue Clive? I mean, I get it, their sole purpose is to protect and look out for the Phoenix, and that is Joshua, but they also still serve the Duchy. And if that is the case, if they serve the Duchy, Clive is the shield of Rosaria. He is the shield of the Phoenix. And he is probably one of the most gifted soldiers along the ranks of the shields. And to me, it just seems like a no-brainer to grab Clive and bring Clive in for multiple reasons. One, he is Joshua's brother. This is very important to Joshua that Clive is okay. Two, he is a very valuable soldier that will give his life to protect Joshua. That is another very important tool for the Undying to have when considering that their sole purpose is to protect the Phoenix. I can go on and on and on about why I think the Undying should have rescued Clive, but the only answer I can come with, and this wasn't really clearly stated, but the only answer I can come up with is maybe they didn't notice him or they didn't have time. Another issue that we run into is the fact that Joshua has family still alive. Byron, we know Byron is still alive. So why didn't the Undying think that it might be a good idea to tell Joshua's uncle that he's alive, that he survived? I mean, this is Joshua's uncle, for crying out loud. And that bothers me that they didn't think that this was important for them to even consider and maybe reach out to Byron, because poor Byron had to live for the longest period of time, for 13 years, thinking that both of his nephews have been killed. The other question I have about the Undying is that, again, we pretty much know that the Undying is a secret organization and that they're pretty much raised from when they are children to become part of the Undying, and their whole sole purpose is to protect the Phoenix and carry out the Phoenix's will. But it's not really explained about where they come from. Are they bears that are made into the Undying? Is the king like selecting different children to recruit into the Undying? Are the Undying just kids of other Undying and the generation just continues and continues to build? We don't really get more details on that, so we don't really know too much about where the Undying comes from, other than the fact that they are extremely loyal to the duchy. Number 4, Ultima's origins. So while we do know a lot about Ultima, we know he came to Valistia to pretty much create humans, help bring them to the point to where someone known as the Mythos will be born, and then using the Mythos as a vessel, they can rebuild and recreate their race. That being said, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but the main one I want to focus on is, where did Ultima come from? All we pretty much got from Ultima is that he came to Valistia because his original home was destroyed by the Blight because they gave too much into magic and it came with a cost. That's all we really pretty much know about Ultima and where he came from. The real interesting part is that he clearly states coming to Valistia specifically. And as I mentioned earlier, Valistia is just one continent on this planet. There have already been hints and teases to other continents on this planet. So why did he specifically come to Valistia? Why did he choose Valistia? And is he an alien? Is he from a different world? Of course, to us, he definitely looks alien. He 100% looks alien. And he kind of hints at coming from a different world, but he never specifically says he's from a different planet. He just says that he's not from Valistia, and he came to Valistia after his home was destroyed by the Blight. And if he was from a different world, a different planet, then why wouldn't he say that he came to this planet? No, specifically he said he came to Valistia. So again, we're left with the situation of trying to figure out if Ultima is an alien or not. And there's some pretty heated arguments about the situation, because you have one side of people saying obviously he's an alien. He said that his planet was destroyed by the Blight. No, technically he said his home was destroyed by the Blight, and he said he came from a different world. He could technically be talking about a different land, a different continent. He never really goes too much into details about that, and he doesn't even give us the name of where he's from. Hell, we don't even know if he's human or not. He could, for all we know, he could be a different variation of the human species. And considering the fact that Barnabas and his mother actually left and they were loyal to Ultima, and they left and went to a different continent and then came back to Valistia to support Ultima and worship him, it tells me that maybe it's possible where Ultima might have came from a different continent. However, the other side of the argument does agree with this. The other side of the argument is that, okay, despite him looking like he's alien, despite him giving all these hints and teases of the fact that he might be from a different planet, we are still left in the dark where some of his references, some of his teases also hint at the fact that he might be from this planet. And all of that's really left unanswered. We don't really have too much details on it. Is Ultima from a different continent, or is he from a different world? That's probably the true question that we want to know. And then we want to know why he specifically chose Valistia over any other continent on the planet. Number 3, the fate of Clive, Dion, and Joshua. So in the in-game section of Final Fantasy XVI, we learned that a lot of characters potentially meet their fate in the final battle against Ultima. But here's the thing, the way it ends for each of these 3 characters really leaves questions and concerns about the fact if they truly really are dead. So let's actually take each of these characters and take a look at them one by one. Let's focus with Dion first. So when we last see Dion, he is fighting Ultima, and after battling with Ultima, we see him falling to his death. Except there's a couple problems here. For one, the only injury that we see on Dion is an injury similar to what we've seen on him before earlier on in the game after his fight with both Joshua and Clive. And after that fight, he had a small injury on the top of his head that was bleeding a little bit. Yet we saw Dion survive from this. We saw him make it through from this. So it's not like his body was turning into stone and his magic was failing him and it was finally taking him away. No, we just see him with a similar injury to what he had before, and he actually survived this incident. Now, another concern is the fact that he was falling to his death. But if you know anything about the Dragoons in Final Fantasy, you would know that they actually don't really receive fall damage. They can jump from really high points and actually land perfectly okay. Plus, since we didn't get to follow his body to see where his body lands or see him come close to contact with the ground, for all we know, he could have easily turned back into Bahamut for a little bit and saved himself. It's also possible that Leviathan the Lost might have shown up and rescued him at some point, or I don't know. Really, the truth is since we've only seen his body falling for a brief moment and he was only showing a small injury similar to what he suffered from earlier, it's hard to say that, okay, he's definitely 100% dead. So yeah, that was an unanswered question, really. So let's move on to Joshua next, because Joshua is another character that really left us wondering if he actually survived or died. And there's a couple different things that actually hint to the fact that he might have survived. First off, before Clive did his last magic ability to take all magic out of the world, he actually goes over to Joshua and heals his body. He uses the power of the Phoenix to heal Joshua. And while it's been stated how the Phoenix can't really bring people back from the dead, it can only heal people before they lose their spirit and stuff, that doesn't necessarily explain Ultima's power, because before Clive goes and does his final spell, he still technically has Ultima's power. And Ultima's plan, his entire plan, revolved around the fact that he was going to use Mythos as his vessel to cast a spell that was going to revive his race, that was going to resurrect his people. If that was the case, then Ultima would potentially be bringing people back from the dead, basically. And if Ultima can do it, I don't see why Clive, with Ultima's power, can't do it before he passes on. And knowing that Ultima's whole plan revolved around the fact that he was going to cast a spell to resurrect his people, to me, it makes sense to think that, okay, maybe, just maybe, Joshua actually survived here. And the final character I want to take a look at is Clive, because he also died during the final battle against Ultima. However, once again, we are left in a situation where we have to speculate and guess if that actually happened. Now, Clive, of the 3, I feel like makes the most sense for actually passing away here because of the situation. There's a lot of things that kind of add up to make more sense that Clive did die, but we don't get a 100% clear ending. We see the stone kind of affecting Clive like he's passing away, similar to how bears use too much magic and turn to stone and pass away. But we really only see it on his arm, which actually resembles Cid from earlier in the game, and we saw Cid had the same curse mark, the same amount of stone on him. Yet Cid was surviving for a decent amount of time after we saw the stone rising up on his arm. Therefore, it's possible Clive could have lasted at least maybe a little bit longer, survived a little while, to maybe even reunite with Jill and talk to everybody at the hideaway, because again, we saw Cid surviving with the same similar curse as Clive. And since we didn't get to finish seeing Clive turn to stone, it's really hard to decide if he actually passed away or not. But as I mentioned earlier, Clive probably makes the most sense for actually passing away here, because there's a lot of hints and teases to the fact that he did, with the star going out resembling the fact that this time around Jill's wish isn't going to be granted and that Clive isn't coming home. There was a whole tearful goodbye between Jill and Clive before he left, kind of hinting at the fact that he wasn't going to come back. So I wouldn't be too surprised if Clive actually is dead. Out of the three, he makes the most sense how they kind of ended it to actually be dead. But alas, we are here trying to decide if Dion, Joshua, or Clive all survived, any of them survived, or even just one of them survived. We just need to know the fate of these three.
Garuda, Ramu, Shiva, Titan, Muhammad, Odin. Even Leviathan the Lost is here.
Number 2, Leviathan the Lost. So from the very beginning, we are told there are technically supposed to be 8 econs. However, with the creation of Ifrit, we learn that there is now a 9th econ. And throughout the game, you battle all these different econs and gain their abilities. However, there is one econ that we really never come face to face with, and that is Leviathan the Lost. And actually, we don't learn pretty much anything at all about this econ, except for they are known as Leviathan the Lost. We don't really get to learn that information because Joshua just pretty much brings it up when he's looking at some ruins, and we don't learn too much about that. So there are a lot of unanswered questions around Leviathan the Lost. Where is the Leviathan? Who is the dominant for Leviathan? Why have they been quote-unquote lost all this time? Really, the only thing we know, and that's pretty much because of a lot of the lore surrounding Final Fantasy XVI, is that Leviathan is the water econ. That's the only thing we know. Everything else I'm about to say is pretty much all speculation. First off, this was obviously left out for DLC in the future. While the developers and creators of Final Fantasy XVI pretty much came out and said that they did not plan to make DLC for this game, we all know that they definitely left some parts of this game out on purpose so that there is room for DLC if they decide to go that route because of the popularity of specific characters maybe, or the popularity of the game itself. So now let's jump into those speculations I was talking about, because there are a lot of different theories out there surrounding Leviathan. First off, because it's a water econ, there's been talks that maybe because it has water properties, and water properties are said to have healing abilities and healing properties, that maybe a character like the little girl that met Dion back in Twinside, maybe she's the dominant for Leviathan, and for whatever reason, she hasn't awakened as the Leviathan yet. That's one of the biggest theories going out right now, is that she might be the dominant for Leviathan, and that in the DLC we'll learn that Dion survives, and we'll learn that he builds a relationship more with this little girl and learns that she is actually the dominant for Leviathan. Another theory that I heavily support is the fact that Edda's baby might be the new dominant for Leviathan, mainly because over in Waloed the entire country was turned into Akashic. There were ether floods all over Waloed, and every single being, for the most part, almost every single being, was turned into Akashic, specifically in this one village. What's weird about that is that this one survivor, this one girl, for whatever reason, did not turn into an Akashic. And what's even more interesting about this is that she is pregnant. Yet all of the rest of the villagers inside that town all turned to Akashic, including any bears that might have been inside that village. They all turned into Akashic as well. And the explanation that was kind of given as to why this girl might have survived and not turned into an Akashic is the fact that maybe her child inside her womb is a bear, and because of that, because of the bear's abilities to resist the ether flood a little bit more than other humans, that bear inside of her protected her from the Akashic and the ether floods. However, that doesn't really explain the fact that she still didn't change, because as I just mentioned, even the bears in the town also changed to Akashic. So if that baby was just a bear, just an ordinary bear, because all the other bears in the town also changed into an Akashic, you would think that she also would have changed as well, and that the bear shouldn't have been able to protect her from the ether flood as well as it did. And the only types of beings on the planet that can resist the ether flood and survive in that town, in my opinion, are dominants. And well, we pretty much know where every single dominant on Valisthea was located at, except for one, Leviathan the Lost. So maybe that baby, Edda's baby, is the dominant, the unborn dominant for Leviathan. Number 1, who wrote the book? So while this might seem like a pretty basic mystery that was completely solved at the start of this scene introduced in the post-credit scene, it's not as clear as it might seem. And this is number 1 because I think it leaves one of the biggest unanswered questions of Final Fantasy XVI and also connects to another unanswered question on this list, Joshua's survival. Because at the end of Final Fantasy XVI, after you get through the credits, we zoom in on a book, and the book is called Final Fantasy, and it is by Joshua Rossfield, who of course is the brother of Clive. That being said, there's a lot of issues that don't 100% tell us really anything about this book and what it actually means. First off, the way it's set up, we don't really know if all of this entire game was either just a dream or just a story that some kids read, because they were playing characters outside in the yard with their dog as characters that are inside this book and inside Final Fantasy XVI story. So we don't really know if this story is fictional and was all just a story or just a dream. I hope that's not the case, because I can tell you straight up that will piss off a lot of fans. But let's say we ignore that fact. Let's say we just ignore the fact that this could have just been all a story or all a dream. Let's focus on this being a book that pretty much told the story, the true story of Final Fantasy XVI. If that's true, then we have to look at who wrote the book. And Joshua is the one that is claimed to have written the book, because it says by Joshua Rossfield. Now, there's a couple issues with this, and there's a couple things that aren't as clear, again, as it sounds. First off, we are led to believe that Joshua never really comes back to life. I mentioned earlier how Joshua, in my opinion, of the 3 that we mentioned, has the best possibility and most likely is someone that survived out of those 3. So if this book is based on a true story in the Final Fantasy world, then it does make sense that Joshua actually wrote this book. That answers that question. And if that is true, then this would confirm that Joshua did in fact survive, and would also answer another question that we talked about earlier, the fate of Joshua. However, with this story, like Final Fantasy XVI, where you had a character that has assumed multiple different personalities throughout the game, it's really hard to tell if Joshua is the one that wrote this book. Because let's take a look at Clive, for example, because Clive actually took up the name Cid after the real Cid passed away, and it was because he wanted to be the figure of the rebellion, the outlaw. So if Clive was the one that survived out of the 3, let's say Clive did survive his injuries in Final Fantasy XVI at the end of the game after casting that spell, then I could easily see Clive wanting to detail the story of everything that happened, especially since Joshua was such a major part of it. I can see him wanting to tell the story of Joshua and the adventure that he went on and everything Joshua did for the land of Valisthea. However, I can tell Clive is also the type of person that doesn't want credit for all of that. For example, he claimed to be Cid, so that Cid got the credit for the rebellion and saving the lands. So I can easily see him doing something similar with Joshua, where he doesn't want the credit of the story, of retelling the story and everything that has happened, and he wrote this book under Joshua's name. That is a distinct possibility. It does actually make sense. So that doesn't really completely clear up the fact that Joshua survived. But another option is that maybe Joshua or Clive didn't write this book. That's a possibility too, because it is very, very possible that Joshua pretty much could have given all the information he has learned throughout Final Fantasy XVI, given them to the Undying, easily could have given them all this information, and the Undying could have wrote this book. And because the Undying obviously don't want the credit for writing this book in the story of Final Fantasy XVI, they could have easily just put Joshua's name on it, because he was the one that recounted all of these events to them. So technically, in a way, he did write this book. The Undying was just the one that pretty much had it published and sent it out and made it public to everybody. So that is a distinct possibility as well. Those are 3 different possibilities that this book could potentially tell. It could answer the fact that Joshua survived, or it could answer the fact that Clive survived, or it could answer the fact that neither one of them survived. This book has so much power, and learning who actually wrote this book would answer not one, but multiple questions on this list. But that's going to do it for this episode of Nerd Space, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hit up those comments. Let me know which of these unanswered questions bothered you and frustrated you the most, and that you wish we saw the answer for in this game. But as always, guys, I will see you on the next episode of Nerd Space. Take care.